this. The reason is I have a little bit of a tendency to overload on information. I apologize. There's been a couple of weeks in this where I piled on pretty heavy with information that was hard to absorb that much in that amount of time. And sometimes I forget I've been collecting information for over like a decade, and I spill like 6 years of information on you in 45 minutes. And so that's not very good. So giving you a broad scope of information, then going back and honing in on some of the finer details tends to be the approach that's working fairly well with this. And so I'm going back now. We're going to leave the British royalty sitting over in Rome where they belong, and Paul can keep them company. And we're going to back up a few more years, back to Joseph and Mary, Mary the mother of Jesus, and Joseph the... Oh, come on, people. The one that Mary married is Joseph the Tecton. Okay, and what is a tecton? Okay, tradesman is the more generic definition of that. We have the somewhat unfortunate translation in all of our modern English Bibles of carpenter, and everybody thinks that a guy carried a hammer and saw around and, sawed lumber and built things like that. As a tecton, he was a tradesman and probably versatile in a number of skills, but it's more than likely that he did fine mosaic stonework, as you would see today, even in the ruins of the town of Sepphoris, which is where some of Mary's family was from and lived there. And that's probably how he met Heli Joachim. Anyway, we'll get back onto that. Heli Joachim, again, being the father of Mary, okay, and the father of Joseph the Tin Man. Okay, there you go. All right. Joseph the Tecton, however, is Joseph the husband of Mary, right? Okay. So here's one of the things that continually comes up, and I've addressed it in a number of ways, but I want to take this on directly this evening, and that is all the traditions that we have and all of the Sunday school lessons and everything, and volumes of books written based on the assumption that Mary was a poor peasant girl. And that, of course, that the poor carpenter that she married could barely provide or anything, and they were just dirt poor people. As I have brought up on numerous occasions throughout this study, there's an array of reasons why that's really not possible. However, let's go back to it from the assumptions of the stories and traditions and everything and approach it from that perspective. And really, my quick summary on this is two categories of discussion. The first one is reasons to believe they were poor. The second one is reasons to believe they were not poor, okay? And so these two butt heads quite a bit. And yet you find within the questions about their poverty, the explanations, I believe, that'll bring you to a good conclusion on that. So first of all, on the reasons to believe they were poor, stories, traditions, and songs. Think, everybody, just real quick, think of a song that you know that you've sung in church or holidays or anything like that that indicated and implied strongly that Joseph and Mary were poor people. Away in a Manger, okay. Something else, another song that you have sung in worship or in church or whatever that implies poor family. Jim. Okay, three wise men bringing gifts. They stopped being poor that day, though, if they were. I guarantee you. That was the end of it. That was lottery Powerball winnings that day. If they were already. But that added to their considerable wealth. Song, The Little Drummer Boy, I'm a poor boy too. What else? How about traditions? What are some traditions that we've carried on in the church pretty much all of your lives that strongly imply a poor family, a family of peasants in poverty? Okay, angels appeared to the shepherds. Go with that. I don't know that that necessarily indicates that the family was poor or not, but it's worth putting on our list. Okay, Harold?
Well, later on, when we went to present Jesus at the temple, the nature of the offering they gave.
And that's going to be one of the things we cover this evening as well. And that's actually a biblical reason. And I would say what he just brought up, and I'll get into it later, the purification or sin offering that Mary brought 40 days later at the temple is probably the strongest argument of all about them being poor. But set that aside. I'm going to get to it in a few minutes, all right? What are some of the other traditions, stories, or songs that you can think of that have led you to believe they were a poor family? Dennis and then Loyal.
Well, I'm just thinking, he would wash other people's feet, and I just can't see a rich man doing that.
Okay. See, there you go. All right. He did this kind of stuff that poor people would do. Loyal.
I see a lot of pictures of them traveling from Nazareth to Bethlehem, always riding in donkeys.
Yeah, and they're just alone. And I would submit the idea that you didn't have just a young couple traveling alone. They had security with them. They had servants with them. They had quite a little entourage for their little party there. Anyway, Ro.
What child is this?
What child is this? Okay. Okay, good. So we have had plenty of reasons to think or believe or just accept without question that the Holy Family, Joseph and Mary, Jesus and his siblings, were a poor household. What good thing could come out of Nazareth? Okay, that's good. Luke Timothy Johnson, he is actually a New Testament scholar, a Catholic for that matter, but oftentimes you can't tell his theology or distinguish too much between his theology and evangelical theology, which is really weird. But nevertheless, he is a New Testament scholar and a writer, and he says this: a rich Jesus is a distortion of history and a threat to one of Christianity's core teachings, God's identification with the poor. Now, he makes a bold assertion there and a strong argument, but to what does he appeal for the support of his premise and his argument? Yeah, we've just always taught it this way, and therefore this is a threat to what we've always taught, okay? Which was surprising to me, being that he is such a New Testament scholar and a critical thinker for that matter. Okay, so let's get down to some of the reasons that we would look at here. The birth in the stable, in the manger, and the swaddling clothes that they used. And some would say, well, if they weren't poor, what in the world are they doing staying out in a stable? Or if... So let's talk in for just a minute. Harold.
Well, the stable wasn't necessarily as I understand it, as we would conceive of a stable or a manger. It was possibly in maybe even a relative's house, part of the house. And they didn't have a place to stay because of the feast and what had been going on, the taxes.
The census that they had declared for taxation, and everybody was to go to their home town, their home of record. And for Joseph the Tecton, good. Joseph the Tecton, his home of record was the town of Bethlehem. He was going there because he and his family owned property there significant enough to be taxed and to be assessed for that reason as part of the census. the whole concept of the inn is a little bit of a misnomer. I know it messes up our Christmas plays and everything else. You got to go knock on the door, and you got an innkeeper who says, sorry, there's no room. Really no inn and no innkeeper in that sense whatsoever. The idea is more of a guest room in a family estate. And since everybody was coming into Bethlehem, all the other family there and everything too, they're just simply saying it was crowded. There wasn't a guest room available for them to have the privacy. Obviously, a calmer, quieter place for them would have been out in the stable. It's attached to the house. It's generally covered, and the manger itself is very carefully constructed. And so we get this view of a family estate being crowded because of the census, and really the word that we're calling inn there was more like a guest room in a family estate sort of thing here. And quite honestly, neither the stable nor the house had central heat and air or running water. They were equal in that respect, except that the stable wasn't crowded like it was in the house. So that puts a little bit of perspective on that, and yet just because of the translation of one phrase in the Bible, in the stable because there was no room for them in the inn. And we've built a whole big story around this with an innkeeper rejecting them, and some even showing them going from one inn to another. Just like we're going to Motel 6, a Holiday Inn, and all this, and trying to find a vacancy, you know. You've even seen the Christmas plays with a motel with a no vacancy sign out, and all of that. And so we've let this thinking become what's defined that experience on Christmas for the family of Jesus, when it probably wasn't much like that at all. So to bring that in your thinking. So the birth in the stable, the use of the manger, and some have even argued swaddling cloths where they just use rags to wrap up the baby. Anybody want to add some insight on that, or you want me to just proceed? Harold, go.
Well, I don't know, today, mothers get advised to swaddle their baby's clothes, so it wasn't necessarily something for use, it was just a good infant care.
Right, it's just wrapping the baby up tightly because they're comforted, especially as a newborn. Y'all know that. You just wrap them up real nice and snug there, and they feel nice and secure. You notice you take that off, and they oftentimes will be crying because they've lost a little security there. So just tightly wrapping the baby up, and a nice little bundle there is swaddling. It has nothing to do with the quality of cloth or anything else, and yet a lot of people have tried to argue, well, they had these swaddling cloths. It must have just been these old rags they found out in the stable or something. Hardly. Yes, sir.
I heard that swaddling clothes were like burial garments. People wore them like we wear underwear.
Well, I'm not real sure on that. Could be. There could be something to that.
That was what was available to them.
Yeah, that's a possibility. I'm still looking at it as this is pretty much the experience of every newborn baby. They would swaddle them, but wrap them up tightly in cloths or blankets or whatever they had.
Don't you kind of have to think about it too, like we think about houses now. Whenever we were growing up, what seemed like a mansion to us, now for middle class folks, standard housing. And so the same way with maybe all, clothing and maybe used burial garment material, but the rich as well as the poor used the same thing. I mean, they didn't have all what we would think rich people could have.
Well, in some cases that would be true. Notice this. Let's get to that offering at the temple. Let me get to Luke chapter 2. Let me get that scripture up and read it real quick here. I'll just pull it off of this Bible. So we're going to Luke chapter 2, verse 22 through 24. This describes how they went to the temple and when, according to the law. And, okay. When the days of her purification, according to the law of Moses, were accomplished, they brought him to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord. Verse 23, as it is written in the law of the Lord, every male who opens the womb shall be called holy to the Lord. Verse 24, and to offer a sacrifice according to that which is said in the law of the Lord, a pair of turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. Okay. And where we get into the discrepancy with the offering is, I'll go to the passage of Scripture in just a moment, back in Leviticus chapter 12. This was under the Levitical law. And and there's some translating things going on there too, but basically it said this. I'll go read it in just a moment. In the Levitical law, after the 40 days for the time of purification, they were to come and offer a young lamb and a pigeon or turtle dove. Okay, but if the alternative was, if they couldn't get a lamb at the time, they could offer the 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons. Now, what has happened is there's been some translating discrepancies with that basically is read, if they cannot afford a lamb, then they can offer the 2 pigeons or the 2 turtle doves. It doesn't actually say if they can't afford it. Almost every one of your modern Bible translations will read, if she cannot afford a lamb. Well, I'm going to go to that in Leviticus chapter 12 real quick, and we'll read it and then discuss it. I'll get into that just a little bit, okay? Because I believe this whole thing of the offering is one of the at least most convincing arguments for their poverty. If they couldn't afford to bring the standard offering and had to bring a reduced offering, then that would make a case for them not being too wealthy, right? So Leviticus chapter 12, I'm going to read verse 1 through 8. We'll get this whole little law figured out here, okay? Okay. Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the children of Israel and say, if a woman has conceived seed and born a man-child, then she shall be unclean 7 days. According to the days of the separation for her infirmity shall she be unclean. And in the 8th day the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised. And she shall then continue in the blood of her purifying 33 days. She shall touch no holy or hallowed thing, nor come into the sanctuary until the days of her purifying be fulfilled. But if she bears a maid child, then she shall be unclean 2 weeks, as in her separation. She shall continue in the blood of her purifying 66 days. A week longer if you give birth to a girl, right? And when the days of her purifying are fulfilled for a son or for a daughter, she shall bring a lamb of the first year for a burnt offering, and a young pigeon or a turtle dove for a sin offering unto the door of the tabernacle of the congregation unto the priest, who shall offer it before the Lord and make an atonement for her, and she shall be cleansed from the issue of her blood. This is the law for her who is born a male or female. Verse 8, here it is. And if she be not able to bring a lamb, then she shall bring 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, the one for the burnt offering, the other for a sin offering. And the priest shall make an atonement for her, and she shall be clean. Now, I read this, the King James is translated from the Masoretic Hebrew text. Several of the others are translated from the Eastern manuscripts that are a little bit different. I'm not even sure this is a manuscript difference. I think it's just a translation difference. But most of them will read, if she cannot afford a lamb, then she can bring the 2 turtle doves or the 2 pigeons. And I did a quick word study on the words for that offering there. It simply means this: to find or attain to find, secure, or acquire, or get. I'm just scanning through a list of definitions. To happen upon, meet or fall in with, to befall, to be encountered, to light upon or be discovered or detected. As you can see, it isn't really about what they can afford. I want to get into a little bit more. There's some other examples of this. Let's think about for just a moment why she would have brought the 2 birds for the offering at the temple rather than a lamb and a bird. Okay? Jim?
Thinking about modern day, you've got a lot of people going into one area, and it's like a run on the grocery store. Maybe they ran out of lamb.
Well, there is a multitude of possibilities. There really are. Consider the environment for just a moment, though. You remember a few years later, Jesus is going in and kicking over the tables and driving them out of the temple and so forth. And much of what was going on was the corrupt priesthood. And here's what would happen. Your family makes a journey to Jerusalem for Passover, and you bring in your lamb that you have carefully had birth in the past year, and you made sure it had no blemish or spot or anything, and you made it a family matter of pride to keep that lamb untouched and pure. You bring it to the priest to bring an offering. The priests have to inspect it, of course, to make sure it's okay. And they say, oh no, this lamb has got disease, is sick, or something wrong with it. We're just going to have to put it in quarantine over here. You can buy one of ours, though. Well, chances, and so this was the environment around the priests and the temple. Therefore, people were not too inclined to pay their exorbitant prices for the animals for sacrifice. In that case, most people would have gone with just whatever because they didn't want to keep supporting the corruption there, obviously. They're not going to throw more money at them than they have to, which is exorbitant to begin with, as you learn later. But on top of that, they were traveling. They were away from home. It was not a convenient thing for them to have a lamb along. Could they have bought one? Well, of course they could have bought one, but the priest would have confiscated it and made them buy one of theirs. That's how things were going then. I can easily see why nobody would have wanted to bring a lamb to the temple for an offering at that time. So there's a lot more to it. And unfortunate in the translation of that in Leviticus 12, where it just says, if they can't afford a lamb, well, that's not really what it's saying at all. It just says, really, if they're not able to bring a lamb, if it's not something that's readily available for them, then the 2 turtle doves or the 2 pigeons. So I think the argument of they had to be poor because of that offering kind of falls pretty weak at that point. Mary Lou. They could have, but who would?
But what if there wasn't a lamb that was unclean?
Well, possibly. I'm sure the priests there would offer up whatever. The ones they're confiscating from others are the very same ones they're selling to the other people coming up. You get it, Harold?
When it says in our English translation, if they could not afford, now, just so for clarification, are you saying actually that the wording there is not translated right? It shouldn't be translated if they could not afford?
Yeah, I prefer the translation that says if she's not able to bring a lamb. That's more accurate, I believe. And again, looking at I just copied real quick the definitions for that not able from the Theological Word Book of the Old Testament. It just takes and gives a definition of all the Hebrew words and phrases there. And And none of those have anything to do about what they can afford. It's more about what's available. So that's why I was reading those definitions for everybody. So again, I think that that is one of the strongest arguments about this, and yet I think it does fall pretty weak. Another example, if a man has leprosy and was later declared free of leprosy, incidentally, that did not happen except for when Naaman, the Gentile, was healed of leprosy. All the years of the history of the Israelites, they had all these details for the purification after someone was healed of leprosy. There was never anybody healed of leprosy until Jesus came along. They never had to exercise these, but they had to know the law, right? But if somebody was a leper and or thought to have leprosy, was later declared to be free from it, they were to bring in a sacrifice. And, okay, here it is in Leviticus chapter 14. On the 8th day, he shall take 2 he-lambs without blemish, 1 ewe-lamb of the first year without blemish, and 3/10 deals of fine flour for a meat offering mingled with oil, and 1 log of oil. Okay, he was to bring 3 lambs, fine flour, and oil, significantly more than what was mentioned before. And then it says, if he is poor, if he be poor and cannot get so much, then he shall take 1 lamb for a trespass offering to be weighed to make an atonement for him, 1/10 of fine flour. But what you're getting here is there's a whole separate accounting given about if someone is poor and an alternative gift that they bring, rather than what we get about the purification there. In this case, the being poor, he still had to bring a lamb. So you get what I'm saying with this. The law of Moses allowed for a man who was poor to bring in only 1 lamb instead of 3 in the fine flour and oil, plus either 2 turtle doves or pigeons. Requirement for someone who was poor, significantly more than the 2 turtle doves or whatever. How poor would Joseph and Mary have had to have been to not even been able to satisfy that? In other words, the argument, I believe, comes out that it wasn't a matter of poverty here. Because, again, in the law, you're given some alternatives for poor, and it still involves bringing a lamb. Okay? Yes, sir.
What kind of a modern analogy do you, let's say Macy's department store had an item of clothing that you were wanting to get, but you felt like that they were just ripping people off, charging a high price for this item, that you could get basically the same item, it might not be as, well, basically the same thing, satisfy your need, at Dollar Tree for a lot less money. Even though you are a very wealthy person, you could, I mean, it's nothing to pay whatever it makes you for that item. Just on the principle that you didn't want to contribute to what you perceive as a kind of corruption.
Yeah, and that's a good parallel, because I think a whole lot of what's going on is everyone is objecting to what the priests are doing at the temple. It was obvious. It was a matter of pretty high level of corruption. Again, I get the argument about the offering at the temple, and I get what people are thinking on that, but I think, again, it's a misunderstanding, which really didn't have any bearing on their situation at all. Another reason you could believe they were poor is in Matthew chapter 8, verse 20, when Jesus said, the foxes have holes and the birds have nests, but the Son of Man doesn't have a place to lay his head. And you get from that, oh, Jesus was just a poor person, a refugee. Jesus was homeless. Talk to me about that. What's the truth in this? Think it through and give some reasoned explanation. In what sense would Jesus have been considered homeless?
He didn't own a home. He was traveling.
He traveled around Israel quite a bit, Bethany and Judea, and even into Samaria a little bit there, all of that.
He was always staying with friends and.
Well, you notice the couple of places that he stayed quite a bit were family estates. The one there where was actually Nicodemus's estate, where Mary and Martha and Lazarus lived and everything. Again, when we mentioned Nicodemus coming to Jesus at night, and we've always pictured that as he's caught him out in the street in an alley somewhere and sneaked up. Oh, Master, would you please tell me? And it's more like he walked down the hall in the house and knocked on the bedroom door, when Jesus was, because Jesus stayed there quite a bit, Again, one of the family associated estates there, if you get that. And I realize some of you haven't got all this and don't know those family connections that I have pointed out. We can get into that too. But just the idea, he didn't own a home of his own. Exactly. I think that's well said. Harold again.
I mean, when today he would maybe put an RVer, but they had no RVs available. I mean, he could have afforded an RV, but they didn't have that available to him. That's the only reason. I mean, he had the money for whatever, but.
Right. And we'll get to that on the reasons to believe they couldn't be poor. Let's look at some of this about the whole idea of glamorizing poverty, though. I want to get to that. I remember my early months or a couple of years when I was a new Christian and really excited about it in church and everything. And I just, somewhere along the way, had bought into this thing that being poor was better than being rich, and that there was virtue somehow in being poor rather than having means, And I'll never forget the first time I heard a pastor in the middle of a sermon say, "There is no virtue in poverty." And I was like, really? How can that be? Now, that had nothing to do with whether Jesus was poor or not. The guy just said, there is no virtue in poverty. There's no, attaining to being poor as if you're somehow going to virtue signal from, look how poor I am. I'm really serving God. Yeah, Dave.
That comes from Jesus saying it's harder for a camel to go through the eye of the needle than for a rich man to get into the kingdom of heaven.
Yep. And there actually was a gate there they called the Eye of the Needle. You know that, right?
I'm sorry?
There was actually a gate that they called the Eye of a Needle and you couldn't get through it on a camel. It was a walk-through thing. So, but yeah, crazy, isn't it? But yeah, in other words, he wasn't making this big metaphor about an actual needle. He was talking about a well-known pastor there, and they knew they couldn't take a camel through that. But anyway, it's saying because the rich don't see their need so much of the time. Okay, so here we go about glamorizing poverty. It encourages more suffering and the spread of poverty by depriving the poor of opportunities for practical help. The best thing we can do for the poor is help them no longer be poor and not laud them in song and story. The poor would rather have a new business to give them a job than hear poems and toasts of romanticizing their poverty. Another historian, Bruce Longnicker, says that, and accurately says this, in Jesus' world there in the first century, life was brutal, and this was true worldwide. About 90% of the people lived in abject poverty. One famine, a bad crop, could completely ruin a family. There was no middle class. Middle class emerged at the very earliest, late 1700s, early 1800s, but really became a thing in the Industrial Revolution. Prior to that, you had all the poor peasants who could not afford education or learning or anything along those lines, generally lived in houses or homes under an overseer or a lord, and anything that they farmed or raised or anything like that, the bulk of that went to the person who owned the land, and they could keep just enough to live off of, and that was how it was. Even up into 19th century, in most of Europe, you couldn't go hunting. You know why? because all the land was owned by the lords or nobility or whatever. You weren't hunting if you went after game, you were poaching. It's theirs. And the majority of the world just lived with that understanding. There is the elite nobility, and then there's all the rest of us who get no say in anything. And no middle class is what I'm getting at. We tend to think, most of us, some level of middle class, we read into the Bible story, most of the people being middle class like us, but they weren't. You either had you're extremely privileged or you're extremely poor. That's what even this says in your notes. In the ancient world, you were relatively poor or filthy rich, very little in between. And I think that bears out throughout all of history. And really nothing to be romanticized or glamorized about the idea of poverty there whatsoever. Let's go around and get back into some of the reasons why we would say it's very difficult to believe they were poor once we start looking at it. First of all, cost of travel. Nazareth to Bethlehem, to be able to stay there, go to the temple after 40 days, but then back in Bethlehem with a house when the Magi came about 18 months later. Now that's interesting, isn't it? So they had a home in Nazareth, and at least 18 months later had a house in Bethlehem. And they could afford to travel and stay during this time as they did this. That's not something for the extremely poor to do. Property to be taxed. That's why they would have traveled to Bethlehem. And yet a village carpenter would have been considered among the poorest of the poor, a village stonemason or tradesman. Yet in Luke's gospel, again, Luke is our top historian, says he was required to travel to Bethlehem for a census. And other writers have also added to this, it couldn't have been required of him unless he owned taxable property there. Additionally, they could afford the long trip from Galilee to Jerusalem every year for Passover. Again, this is not what you see from the extreme poor. But let's go a little further. Let's look at the family. Mary's family, her father, Joachim, very, very wealthy man, considered one of the wealthiest men in the world at the time. He and his business partner, Nicodemus, both council members, but they controlled the grain monopoly throughout the Middle East and possibly all the Roman Empire at that point. This was not what you would consider a poor family. Now, and her brother, let me reiterate on this. When Luke talks about Joachim having a son named Joseph, he is not talking about Joseph the Tecton. He is not talking about the husband of Mary. He is talking about Joachim, who is the father of Mary, having a son named Joseph. And that's the one I've named here. Now, again, most of your historical sources dated after the 5th century will place Joseph as being Heli's brother and Mary's uncle rather than Heli's son, Mary's brother. And again, I've spoken before about why they brought that about, and that was when they first introduced the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception and the perpetual virginity of Mary and the sinlessness of Mary. But the Immaculate Conception is not about the birth of Jesus, it was about the birth of Mary, and that meant that her mother then would have had to have been in a situation where Mary could be conceived without sin. I realize this. Most people, most Protestants, when you see the Catholic words Immaculate Conception, you think it's talking about the conception, the birth of Jesus. It is not. It's talking about the conception of Mary, the mother of Jesus. Check it out. It's not hidden. It's not a big thing. Just look it up. It's clear as a bell. However, the little glitch in this is this did not become truly canonical doctrine until in the 18th century. But they started it back in the early 5th century. And that's when they started making some shifting in order. What I'm simply saying is Mary's mother could not have also given birth to a son at the time in order for them to be consistent on that doctrine. And that is when even Pope Gregory and some of them started making demands for purging some historical records. I'm sticking with what Luke says, that Joseph is Heli's son, and plus some other early historical records that give us the same thing. Even though if they were right and Joseph is her uncle and the brother of her dad, he's still one of the wealthiest men in the world. And remember, Joseph the Tin Man is called such because he had a fleet of ships. He was picking up the mining ores of copper and tin in the British Isles and trading that all over the world. We have historical records of all the Mediterranean. Joseph also had a place in Marmor there, the coastal port town in Egypt. But we have records of him trading throughout the Mediterranean, down through the Indian Ocean in India. And there are even some historical records of his ships traveling to South America for some of their trading. He was referred to as the nobilis decurium, as a Roman official, which was a manager of the Roman mining districts. The guy had connections all over. You could drop him penniless anywhere in the world, and he would make his connections and be right back in place in no time. The guy had connections everywhere. But, you know, we've got into all that, especially with his connections in Western Europe. Nevertheless, Joseph, brother of Mary, is an extremely wealthy man. Heli, father of Mary, extremely wealthy man. How then does Heli and his wife give birth to a peasant girl? I just am having trouble seeing it. Now, Joseph, husband of Mary, his occupation is tekton. This is what makes it an odd marriage. We went over this in one of the earlier studies. How in the world does a tradesman, the tekton, as otherwise translated carpenter in most cases, how in the world does he get connected to a Hebrew princess from the line of David and the daughter of one of the wealthiest families around? These are arranged marriages and sometimes planned from before they're even born. And usually the fathers get together and arrange these marriages. And there's generally a sense of status, of social and economic status going on there. And so here you've got this tradesman who ends up a husband of Mary, of all people. The daughter of, again, the family descended from David, in line for the throne even, should that be the case, and extremely wealthy. Do y'all remember some of our conversation from before about how in the world those two could have even got together? How would her dad have ever allowed this marriage? Yeah, nevertheless, he's in a whole different economic class than the woman he married, you know.
I think he said that he was doing work for Heli.
Well, and again, this is an area where I don't have actual historical documentation and proof. This is a little bit of speculation because of how things were typically done.
Maybe Joseph did such an outstanding job that Mary's dad said, "This is so awesome, I'll give you anything, what would
Well,
you like?" And he says, "I'm gonna
That is the theory that I posed earlier on this. If you've ever seen the pictures of the ruins at Sepphoris, the mosaics in the floors of the buildings, the streets, walls, everywhere, all fine stonework. And I'm pretty convinced that that's the kind of work Joseph did. It was extremely exquisite artistry done with stones and colored stones and all of this. But And chances are he took on a job for Heli, possibly building an addition onto their home. And in general, it was like commissioning a piece of art and looking at it afterwards and letting the client determine the value, okay? And remember the story of the young woman who came out and danced in front of Herod? And he said, name your price. This was so amazing, so beautiful. Just name your price. What is it? Well, you know, the guy, John the Baptist, I'll have his head on a silver platter. Done. In this particular case, probably, I mean, this is one of the ways this could have happened. Because at the big feast days of Israel, that's when the fathers would get together and they would do some drinking and have some fun, all this kind of stuff. But they would also do some very serious negotiating over who's marrying who and what the dowry is going to be, all this kind of stuff, right? That wouldn't have happened between Heli and Joseph's dad. But somehow, so possibly his work was so good, and Heli said, name it. What's your price? Meanwhile, he and Mary had been consorting somewhat together and trying to figure out how they could be together. And he says, I realize this may be offensive to you, but I'm going to ask anyway since you said it. Hand of your daughter in marriage. Mary. I'm in love with her. She's in love with me. We want to be married. Yeah.
It also maybe wanted to take this great this great, artist and sort of tie up his business so he didn't go elsewhere.
Well, possibly so. And also remember, they could afford to pack up and run to Egypt and stay there for about 3 years, or a couple years at least, before coming back. They could leave the country and go live elsewhere abroad for a couple years and then return. That's not poor people. Yep.
Kind of building on what you said.
But yes.
I kind of can see how, that Mary's father would see how some of the rich boys in the family, not necessarily Joseph was in there, but maybe he had other sons, or at least nephews or whatever. They were spoiled rats. And he didn't
No.
see that they would maybe be the best for his daughter.
He could have been impressed with the character of Joseph as well as his work. Yeah. It would probably have been a combination. Yeah.
And Daryl said he's looking at it from a business angle. He's saying this boy's, he's stuck in that vision. He may not.
But now consider this. In fulfilling that marriage, she gave up a lot of her status, didn't she? Because typically, who would she have been married to? Royalty from a nearby nation or another Hebrew family off in another area or whatever, someone who was considered of the noble class among the Hebrews and of wealth. So in taking this on, she gives up some of her status, socially at least. And that's why when she's having the conversation with the angel, she refers to herself as a woman of low estate. It's not because she's talking about her poverty or anything, but just because, well, first of all, I doubt they could convince everybody that her untimely birth was the Holy Spirit. It just has never happened before. We've never seen that. So most people would say, yeah, I bet, right? And so she had a little bit of shame from that. Joseph did as well, and giving up some status by not marrying in her class. And then she referred to herself as a woman of low estate, given all of that.
Well, maybe the father, I know this is out on a limb, maybe her father was kind of like Susanna Wesley. And John Wesley's mother didn't like royalty. I mean, that was a big cause of friction between John Wesley's mother and father. He was pro-crown, she was very anti-crown. And I'm just wondering, maybe he didn't like all these royal people. I mean, he was rich, but he didn't like
there's a lot of possibilities there. But again, I think the biggest anomaly in this is the two of them ended up married. That's a mystery, and I'm
It's really not a mystery because I'm sure they truly love each other.
well, again, that's part of my argument is part of his appeal to Heli about marrying Mary would have been, I love her and she loves me. And he asks Mary and he says, yes, please, please, I want to marry him, whatever. But it had to be something like that. It would not have been the normal arranged marriage is what I'm saying. So anyway, there's a lot going on there. Nevertheless, one thing is firmly established, and that is Mary's family was extremely wealthy. And then we have another layer added to this, the gifts of the Magi. Now, do you suppose they brought like $25 worth of gold? What do you think? Now, notice this. These are men who've traveled for months, okay? And again, let me paint this picture. In our Christmas plays, we've got three guys with pretty hats on who come up. These guys were extremely wealthy themselves, had traveled a great distance for months. How many people do you think were with them for security, to wait on them, their families, and whoever else was along on the journey? I have estimated at least 200 people in this caravan who arrived, maybe more. Imagine, they have found gifts fit for a king and a king that the stars of the heaven have announced. That's pretty big stuff. And again, you think they brought 25, 30 bucks worth of gold and said, here you go, good luck to you, kiddo. Now think about this. What would they have brought? They would have brought coffers of wealth, gold and frankincense and myrrh, all highly expensive commodities in their particular time. And even if there was some question about the economic status of this family prior to this, it ended that day. But I'm saying they were already crazy wealthy, and then they get the gifts of the Magi, which would have probably provided for generations and generations to live well. I'm just saying, Jim.
I always wondered what kind of connection did the priest, the chief priest, and the scribe church had to do with the wealthy people and being able to move to different places so easily. What kind of role did they have?
The priests, so far as
I'm thinking about like a Godfather issue. You know, is that am I too far out?
well, maybe not. Let me see if I can come up with something that fits in with that. You see, it was the priests who really had initiated the persecution of the followers of Christ, and especially after the crucifixion and resurrection.
But they also had a lot of control over the sacrifices.
Oh, they truly did.
The priests were eating pretty good. You know, they got the best lambs and
Oh yeah, they were top of the food chain themselves. Yeah.
so why wouldn't they have a role in helping the Tecton moving in the areas of, you know, out of that area into another area?
It's possible. I don't see a big connection there where they were trying to help there. From the moment Jesus appears doing anything, they despised him. They saw him as a threat. So it might go the other way. But notice this. Joseph, or Tin Man, Joseph the Tin Man, Joseph of Arimathea, and learned another name for him last week. Remember that one? It's from the name of the town in Egypt where he had his place there, Marmor. Okay, Joseph de Marmor. But he had a close relationship with Pontius Pilate. And it was in 36 AD when Pilate got reassigned and taken out of Israel that they really cracked down, and that's when they were able to take Joseph and some of his closest circle and exile them by putting them on a boat and dragging them out into the middle of the Mediterranean and leaving them, as they'd done with many others. And most of them died, many were rescued. In this case, he made landfall in North Africa, then arranged passage to go to France, where Philip the Evangelist met him. But my point being, the role of the priests in that, and the only thing that was restraining them from their more aggressive persecution was Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor there. So, if that's worth anything to you. Okay, so gifts of the Magi. They had a house in Bethlehem when the Magi came. Once again, had a place in Nazareth. They traveled to Bethlehem, stayed there for some time. Obviously had taxable property in Bethlehem as part of the census and the taxation effort. But then they fled to Egypt. And in returning from that, we're looking at Jesus as being 3-4 years old, him being about 18 months old when the Magi come. And so they were able to leave the country, go live in Egypt for some time, and still return and have a place again without any visible means of other income. I'm saying they were not poor people to be able to do that. And I'd written a little bit here. Matthew's gospel, they owned a house in Bethlehem, their hometown, not Nazareth. After the Magi, the wise men brought their gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. They would have been rich beyond their wildest dreams, but they already were, easily able to support themselves for as many years as needed in Egypt before King Herod died, and they could return. On the return journey to their home in Bethlehem, Joseph was warned in a dream of further danger in Judea, so they turned aside, traveled back to Galilee, where they settled in a city called Nazareth, right? Presumably, they still had enough money to get a house there and could afford to abandon or have someone dispense with the place in Bethlehem, or let some other family member or whatever have occupancy of that. So, yeah. Mary Lou.
I think it's a compelling argument that if he was dirt poor, like, you know, his classes people, if he was actually dirt poor, that he would never have been respected enough to be listened to or followed or anything like that, and they would not have, they would have just dismissed him and never.
Yeah, there would have just been absolute obscurity and, just scrapping away for survival, and that wasn't the case at all here. You start reading between, again, the title of this series, Between the Lines. You start picking up what's between the lines and interpreting that with what we've got historically that's hidden in plain sight. Once again, I keep saying, you don't have to look very far to find most of the information I've talked about. In case any of you have looked, a quick Google search even, and like somebody said, yeah, but you'll get a ton of different sources. Yeah, you got to have your discernment and filter on with all of that, but you see right away how much information is out there about the family and the extended family of Jesus and the other characters that I brought up in these studies. There's a vast amount of historical information that you don't even have to dig that much to find. It's amazing to me that the church ignores all of that and makes up a false narrative instead. Maybe not a harmful narrative, but it certainly keeps the truth obscured, doesn't it? Anyway, for what all that's worth. And incidentally, I'm thinking I'll go ahead and next week give you more of Mary's family. We talked a lot about Heli, but what time is it? I got a minute. I got 1 minute. Okay, but I'll get into a little bit of Mary's family because you remember where Joseph ended up after he left Israel, back in Cornwall in Britain, among the isles where he had been getting the ore smelted out from the Jews, the Hebrews who lived there, and were doing that work, right? So they had been there for centuries already. Mary's mother's family was from there originally also. So I'm going to give you some of that. We'll get into some of that next week. Remember how I kept bringing up the connection between Rome and Britain in the first century, the British royalty and the church at Rome and everything going on there? It was like they had a highway and everybody was running back and forth, but it was really just the wealthy and the elite and the royalty and, you know, all those who could afford the security to do that kind of thing. And yet that had been going on for quite some time. We'll get into that with Mary's maternal ancestors in that family next week. Okay. Thanks for coming.
You're saying, I mean, one thing, you're saying you shouldn't glorify poverty.
I'm saying there's no